Good evening and a very warm welcome to this Wellington Trust lecture. Let me start by passing on sincerest apologies from Alistair Chapman, our chairman, who's been called away on business at short notice and can't be with us this evening. For those of you who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, I'm David Hogben and I'm Vice Chairman of the Trust. First of all, I should mention a few housekeeping issues. The lecture should take around 45 minutes. There will be time for questions following the lecture, and do please stay on for the question and answer session following the lecture. If you have any questions during that session, please use the raise hand symbol, and my fellow trustee, Jenny Mosley, will facilitate the question and answer session. Following the question and answer session, there'll be time for our now regular and less formal chat at the end. If you'd like to take part in that chat, please stay on. It will take a minute or so for everyone to be allowed on, because you have to be allowed on one by one. And when Matt has let everybody in, we will have the less formal chat. Finally, we will be forwarding a link to access a recording of the lecture. It's my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for this evening, Glyn Evans. Glyn is a friend of the Wellington Trust and a member of the Honourable Company of Master Mariners, and many of you will know him from his articles in the Honourable Company's journal, published under Monthly Jottings. Glyn has had a lifelong interest in seafaring, and his early interest in ships and shipping was sparked by his upbringing around the docklands and riverfront of the River Mersey. Having spent his long career in marine insurance, Glyn is now retired and living, I'm proud to say, in the Garden of England. A man of many talents, Glyn has written a number of books, detail of which will be following later in the lecture. And as an amateur painter, his paintings have been exhibited at the National Waterways Museum and Gloucester Docks. Over to you, Glyn.
Thank you very much, David.
So Glyn, that's it. Have you got control?
There we are, we have control. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Very warm welcome to my talk this evening, Operation Title, which was an Allied mission in 1942 to put out of action or sink the German battleship Tirpitz with the help of this little fishing boat that you can see in the picture here, Arthur. The operation was very much a battle of little and large, David and Goliath. According to the Bible, 1 Samuel 17, verse 48, we learn that David slew Goliath. But unfortunately, in our talk this evening, Arthur versus Tirpitz, the outcome wasn't quite the same. Let's have a look at Tirpitz first of all. Tirpitz is our Goliath. Tirpitz was crewed by over 2,000 men, length over 100 feet, 8 15-inch guns, 12 5.9-inch guns, 16 4.1-inch guns, and a speed of round about 30 knots. So she was twice the speed of the normal convoy speed, which would have been around 10 to 12 knots. As a comparison, so that most of you who know HMS Wellington, Tirpitz was 3 times the length of Wellington, and Arthur, well, history says 70 foot. Other bits of history say 55 feet. Either way, she was a tiddler compared with Tirpitz. The very existence of Tirpitz was a threat to Allied shipping. This is a picture of Tirpitz in Trondheim Fjord. As you can see, she was heavily protected, not only by nature, the high sides of the fjord, but also by her own anti-aircraft armament, anti-aircraft guns ashore, anti-submarine nets, smoke screens, and also the German Luftwaffe had stations around the Norwegian coast that they could set off their fighter planes when the alarm went up. So, as I say, her very existence was a threat. Prime Minister Winston Churchill referred to the Tirpitz as the Beast, and he wrote on the 25th of January 1942, the destruction or even the crippling of this ship is the greatest event at this present time. No other target is comparable to it. Acting on Winston Churchill's words, the RAF set about putting an end to Tirpitz, and between January and April 1942, those attempts were unsuccessful, with the loss of 17 aircraft and 64 RAF crew. There had to be another way of getting rid of Tirpitz. The threat of Tirpitz affected the Arctic convoys. The Arctic convoys were taking military supplies through to Russia. The convoys were given the nomenclature PQ and a numeral for the outward convoys and PQ for the home convoys. The Tirpitz was ideally placed to break out from the Norwegian fjords and affect the convoys, as we can see from this map here. The outer blue line shows the summer route, and the inner blue line shows the winter route. Trondheim Fjord, where Tirpitz spent quite a lot of time, is visible just under the picture of Tirpitz. And so you can see that it wouldn't take much for Tirpitz to come out and disrupt these vital convoys. The story of Convoy Pq-17, which sailed from Murmansk on the 27th of June 1942, will probably be familiar to quite a few of you. The convoy set off with 35 merchant ships. 2 had to turn back, so it was 33 merchant ships, which set out with a huge cargo amongst them, nearly 300 aircraft, nearly 600 tanks, lorries, and 156,000 tons of military and general cargo. The convoy, of course, had an escort. There was a close escort, number 1 escort group, which consisted of 6 destroyers, 11 corvettes, minesweepers, armed trawlers, and 2 auxiliary anti-aircraft ships. This escort was almost double what would have been provided for on the North Atlantic convoys, with a comparable number of merchant ships. In the background of the close convoy escort was a heavy escort waiting in the background should they be needed to be called up. On the 4th of July 1942, after PQ-17 had been at sea for a while, the Admiralty received a message from Norwegian intelligence to say that the Tirpitz was sailing to intercept the convoy. The Admiralty sent a message to the convoy, most immediate, cruiser force withdraw westward at high speed. The cruiser force was the heavy escort, distance heavy escort, and they were ordered to withdraw. Shortly after that, another message from Admiralty to the convoy, immediate. Owing to the threat of surface warships, convoy is to disperse and proceed to Russian ports. And then shortly after that, most immediate, my 21-23 of the 4th, convoy is to scatter. This was a most unwelcome, most unusual message, for the convoy to receive. It must have been received with great trepidation, but the Admiralty orders had to be obeyed, and so the convoy scattered. With the dispersal of the escorts and the dispersal of the convoy itself, the action was open for 11 U-boats, 33 torpedo aircraft, and 6 bombers to attack at will. The result was the loss of 24 merchant ships sunk and the loss of 153 lives. We move back a few months now from PQ-17. We go back to warmer climes. We're going to the Mediterranean. 19th of December 1941, the Italian raid on Alexandria Harbour. Alexandria Harbour was housing the British fleet in the Eastern Mediterranean. It was heavily defended with its submarine nets, anti-aircraft, and all the usual mines and patrol boats. But nevertheless, 2 battleships were damaged, HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Valiant, plus the destroyer HMS Jarvis and a tanker Sagona. So how did this come about? Well, the answer lay in the Royal Italian Navy's 2-man torpedo, which they nicknamed the Pig. 3 of these were taken by submarine to somewhere just outside Alexandria Harbour. The Pigs were slipped out of their tubes that were welded on the deck of the submarine, and the Pigs, with 2 men on each, made their way through the submarine nets into the harbour and planted their torpedoes and mines under these ships with devastating effect. Queen Elizabeth and HMS Valiant were put out of action for many, many months. It was a huge embarrassment, a great waste of fleet time, and a great waste of money. Admiral Sir Max Horton, who was a former submarine commander in World War I and later Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches Liverpool in 1943, was quite shaken up by events. Shaken up in more ways than one, because he happened to be on HMS Queen Elizabeth at the time. He was a man of action who knew all about submarines and submariners, and he was the man to take further action. We move back another year, this time to 1940, 30th of June 1940, when the Germans invaded the Channel Islands. Now, you might be wondering what this has got to do with an attack on the Tirpitz, but I'll explain as we go along. The Germans, when they invaded the Channel Islands, set about building an impregnable fortress. The fortifications that they put up in 1940 onwards are still there, and they can be seen today. This was part of Germany's Atlantic Wall that was going to spread from Norway to northern Spain, and it was going to protect the Third Reich forever. The British intelligence wanted to know what this wall was, what the fortifications were, how they were built, what they would withstand. And this was important because if the Allies were to invade Europe at a later date, they wanted to know exactly what they were up against. And so Operation Basalt was put into motion, and this was a 12-man commando raid on the Channel Island of Sark on the 3rd of October 1942. The idea of the mission was to capture some German officials who would then be interrogated to find out exactly what the fortifications were. The operation was classed as a success. 12 commandos landed on Sark. They captured a German officer, a major, in the engineering division of the German Army of Occupation. And he was brought back to the UK and was interrogated and sang like a canary, as the saying goes. Everything the Allies wanted to know about the fortifications was gained, but was it a victory? Shortly after the raid on Sark, Hitler learned of this. He was absolutely furious, and he issued his infamous, supposedly secret Commando order, 18th of October 1942. From now on, all men operating in so-called commando raids are to be annihilated to the last man. If these men were caught by the police in occupied territories, they to be handed over to the German authorities. To hold them in military custody, i.e. an ordinary prisoner of war camp, was strictly forbidden, and all commanders and officers were responsible for any omission to carry out this order. So it was really a question of shoot or be shot. Admiral Sir Max Horton said, "A chance lost in war may never recur." And so he set about putting into action what the Italians had already done and giving the Germans back what he thought they should receive. If you saw the film Above Us the Waves, you will get some idea of what happened on Operation Title. Not quite accurate, but nevertheless, we don't let the facts spoil a good film. Admiral Horton gave the command of training and bringing this new warfare into operation by putting in control commanders W. Tiny Fell and G. Sladen. And work commenced on the British version of the human torpedo, which was named the Chariot. The experiments were very much learn as we go along. Lots of mistakes were made. The training of the men was very, very intense. They were physically fit by the end of it all. They had to go through their diver escape hatch training. They had to learn to maneuver on these chariots. They had to learn to navigate at dark in cold water with just a compass. They had to learn to dive, to surface, to cut through anti-submarine nets, to plant their charges, and in every way be able to use these machines effectively. Some of the trials started off down in Portsmouth, then they moved up to Scotland, where the conditions were more as they would find when they went over to Norway, although at this stage, the men didn't know exactly what their target was to be. The chariots were 22 feet in length. They traveled at just 3 knots. They had an endurance of 8 hours, a maximum operating depth of 27 feet, and they carried at the front of them a 600-pound Torpex charge. David, the control doesn't seem to be with my...
You got it back?
Yes, we have. We have it back. Yes, this is the plan of the fishing boat Arthur that shows the layout and the fixture of the chariots that were to be attached to the bottom of the ship. The idea was that the fishing boat would take the chariots across the North Sea from the Shetlands to Norway. The chariots would be under canvas cover on top of the hold. The hold was had a cargo of peat, and that was to be the cover story for the reason for Arthur to be in the Norwegian fjord. A fixing lug was attached to the underside of Arthur's keel, and from the lug, a short cable was attached to shackles at the front of the two chariots. Between the hold, bulkhead, and the engine room, a false bulkhead was fitted, as you can see at the red dots there. And this is where the Royal Navy party would hide if they were caught by a German patrol.
Click on your screen, Glyn.
Sorry?
Click on your screen.
Done that. Yeah, there we are. So that was the plan. The operation had so many problems to overcome, not least of which was the documentation to make sure that when they were stopped by the German patrol and going up the fjord of Norway up to where the Tirpitz was hiding out, they were bound to be stopped by German patrol. So here we have Operation Title. The Arthur was to be crewed by 4 Norwegians. Leif Larsen was to be the captain, Jornoy engineer, Calvé the deckhand, and Strand the radio operator. Leif Larsen, most decorated Norwegian of the Second World War, was no stranger to travelling across to Norway from Shetland. He was operating what was called the Shetland bus, which was a loose title for the fishing boats operated by the Norwegians that were part fishermen, part pirates, part gunrunners, part smugglers, but they were bringing out from Norway refugees. They're bringing out volunteers for the Allied forces, and they're taking back over to Norway SOE operators, ammunition, arms for the Norwegian resistance. It was a tricky business. The weather conditions, the Luftwaffe's attention to anything that was found sailing around the Norwegian coast all made it highly dangerous, but Larsen seemed to laugh in the face of adversity. And it was Larsen who had liberated Arthur from a previous owner and brought her over from Norway to the Shetland Islands. On the left, we can see the typical weather that was encountered on the Shetland bus crossings. These little fishing boats, 50 or 60 feet in length, took a tremendous hammering. And sadly, during the first couple of years of German occupation of Norway in operating the Shetland bus, 44 Norwegian seamen lost their lives in making the crossing. So the Royal Navy party who were going over on Arthur in their attempt to sink the Tirpitz was made up of Sub-Lieutenant Brewster, Able Seaman Brown, Craig, who was a sergeant in the Royal Engineers but had transferred to the submarine service, Evans, who was a naval seaman in the submarine service, and 2 dressers, Tebb and Cowser. The dressers were reserve divers, but they were dressers because they were required to get the divers into their diving suits. This is a frogman's outfit from 1945, but the outfits in 1942 were clumsier. They had lead-weighted boots. It was just almost impossible to, well, it was impossible to get in them on your own. And so 2 divers had 1 dresser each to get them into their diving gear. The chariots weighed almost 2 ton. And so Arthur had the boom or the derrick on her main deck strengthened so that they could lift these chariots in and out of the water. On the 26th of October 1942, Operation Title got underway, and here we can see Captain Larson stepping aboard Arthur with all the papers, all the documentation, the cargo, the equipment, the diving equipment, the chariots, etc., everything in place, ready for the transit across the North Sea, through the islands outside the fjord, and then up the fjord. So with everything in place, all the excitement, all the equipment, all the training, what could possibly go wrong? Well, in fact, whatever could go wrong did go wrong. The ship made it across the North Sea, but it was a very rough crossing, and that took its toll on equipment and on the men themselves. Several times they had to go on deck to make sure that the chariots were still in place. As they were traveling through the islands up the fjord, the engine started to belch black smoke and eventually broke down. They drifted into the coast, anchored off one of the islands, and Larson went ashore, where he was able to contact someone who had been advised that he might arrive and might need help. In fact, he had a password which he gave to the, it was the postmaster of the local village. He gave the password to the postmaster, "Would you like any peat?" The postmaster had forgotten the answer and said, "No, we're okay for peat, thank you." Whereas he should have said, "Yes, we require some peat." This was overcome. The postmaster took Larson to the local blacksmith. The blacksmith gave him some drills and bits. Larson took them back on board and the engine was repaired. So on they chugged further up the fjord, and then it came time to put the chariots over the side. Before the chariots were put over the side, one last thing to do was to top up the batteries with the generator that was on the main deck. At this stage, it was found that the generator didn't function. So the generator was unceremoniously tipped overboard, and it meant that the divers just had to rely on the fact that the charge in the batteries of their electric motors on the chariots was going to be sufficient to carry them onto their final journey. So the chariots were put overboard, tied to the cables, and off they went further up the fjord. And then they met the inevitable, which they're prepared for, and this was the German patrol boat. The ship's papers, please, Captain. The German officer in charge of the patrol boat came on board and went down with Larson to examine the ship's papers. On deck, one of the young German sailors was looking intently down in the clear waters of the fjord at what he could plainly see, and that was the chariots were visible to this young lad. One of the Norwegians, quickly thinking, picked up a mooring rope and threw it at the lad, hitting him on the head. He retired under deck in embarrassment, and the chariots went unnoticed. The papers were found to be in order. The Royal Navy party, meanwhile, were stuck in their little compartment, just 2 foot wide, below deck, keeping silent, hoping that everything was going to plan. Eventually, the Arthur was given the all clear, and set off again on its journey ever closer towards the Tirpitz. Then what else could go wrong? As Arthur turned a cape in one of the bends in the fjord, a terrific storm came down from the mountains, whipped the seas up into an enormous frenzy, as you can see in this illustration here. The ship was bouncing from crest to trough, and an ominous banging noise could be heard underneath the hull, grinding, banging, and then it suddenly ceased. As the ship got into calmer water, diver Evans was dressed in his diving suit, sent overboard, and came back with the news that was almost expected, that the chariots had in fact become detached and were nowhere to be seen. The fjord at certain points is 2,000 feet deep. There was no way of going back. The chariots could not be retrieved. The cables were still attached to the hull of Arthur, but the shackles that attached the cable to the chariots had fractured. And at point A, which is on the left-hand side of this chart here, it was decided without any doubt that the mission had to be abandoned. At point B, at the middle, there was the point where Arthur would have let the chariots go off on their final 10-mile journey from B to X, where the Tirpitz lay. So there's nothing for it, but the attack had to be abandoned. Larson took the Arthur up to point C, which is at the top middle there. Arthur was scuttled. The crew and the divers made their way ashore and set off to get across to the safety of the Swedish border. What they didn't know was that Arthur didn't sink. She was waterlogged. It was her cargo of peat that probably kept her afloat, and she floated slowly, waterlogged, down to point D and went aground in shallow water, where she was later discovered by the German authorities. So now, having got inland and away from the boat, the 10 men of mission title split up into two groups. Group 1, with Sub-Lieutenant Brewster in charge, had 2 Norwegians, Calver and Jornoy, and 2 of the divers, Kauser and Brown, and they set off on the journey heading for Sweden. We're talking now of November in Norway. They had between 5 and 7 days taking a crossing that involved frozen rivers, rounding lakes, through forests, ever upwards, ever upwards. Eventually they would have to climb to 6,000 feet to get over the Norwegian border into Sweden. Throughout the 7 days, they were able in some cases to get assistance from loyal Norwegians. In other cases, they were turned away by farmers who were frightened of the German reprisals. Sometimes they just hid up in empty huts in the mountains. All they had with them were the clothes they were dressed in, their sea boots, a change of socks, and a couple of cans of emergency rations. The training that they had really didn't put them in a proper place for this, and they really, really suffered with fatigue, with frostbite, etc. But at the end of 7 days, Group 1 managed to get over the border into Sweden, where they were put in touch with the Norwegian embassy. Group 2 had the same conditions to contend with. Group 2 was Captain Larson in charge with another Norwegian, Strand, and 3 of the naval crew, Craig, Tebb, and Evans. They suffered the same privations, the same experiences trudging through the snow. The higher they got, the deeper the snow got. They were brushing through the forest where their clothes were getting wet, their feet were getting soaked, they were getting cold. Once or twice they were able to get some assistance. Other times they were chased away, which was understandable. Other times they just had to find shelter where they could. The tiredness, the cold, the frost, etc., was taking its toll on them too. When they were just a few miles from the border with Sweden, they were received hospitably by a family who took them in, gave them shelter for one night, fed them, and set them on their way. Larsen and Strand, the two Norwegians, left their pistols with the two young lads who said that they were going to join the Norwegian resistance. And so the group two set off again with only a few miles to go to the border. Unfortunately, they bumped into a Norwegian police patrol. Two Norwegian police with their pistols already drawn stopped the group, asked them where they were going, what they were up to, where they were coming from. And for once, Larsen wasn't able to bluff his way out. The police officers said that they would take them down to the local town where they would be interrogated by the German authorities. And so they were turned round with Larsen and Strand in front, Craig, Tebb and Evans following, and the two Norwegian police officers following with their pistols drawn. At this stage, Tebb decided that he wasn't going to be taken into captivity, and he said to Evans, we're going to fight our way out of this. He managed to draw his pistol from his underarm holster and turned and fired at the Norwegian police. Shots were exchanged. One of the police officers was injured and unconscious. The other police officer ran off to get assistance, assuming that everyone else was armed. In the shootout, Evans had been hit also and was lying semi-conscious with a bullet wound to the stomach. The other four knew that they wouldn't be able to take Evans to the border with them. He was 6'3" and weighed 14 stone. They were struggling just to get themselves across the border. And so they made him as comfortable as they could, left him there, hoping that he would be taken into hospital and treated under the Geneva Convention. So Larsen, Strand, Craig and Tebb made it across the Norwegian border into Sweden, where they were met up with the other group. They were given hospital treatment. Several were suffering with frostbite. Several toes had to be removed. But eventually, after a month, they were repatriated to the UK. Having given their reports to the authorities, the office of the Commodore of Royal Naval Barracks, Devonport, sadly had to write to Evans' parents to say, we're writing to advise you that your son, Robert Paul Evans, is reported as missing from a most secret operation in Norway. We can assure you that every effort is being made to establish the circumstances and to find your son's current whereabouts. We'll be in touch again as soon as we have further information to report. And to be fair to the office of the Commodore, everything was done to find out where Evans was. The Red Cross and the Norwegian intelligence and resistance were all checked frequently to find out exactly where he was. We move now to another operation which does impinge slightly on Operation Title. This was Operation Gunnerside, which was the successful destruction of the Norsk Hydro heavy water plant of Bemork in Norway. This was February 1943, and you probably saw the film how Kirk Douglas completely destroyed the Norsk Hydro heavy water plant. But prior to that, in November 1942, there was another operation to try and put the plant out of order, and that was Operation Freshmen. Operation Freshmen set out roughly the same time as Operation Title. 2 Halifax bombers with 7 crew, 2 Horsa gliders, each with 2 pilots, and 15 Royal Engineers in each of the glider, making a total of 48 men setting off, flying from Scotland across the North Sea to Norway, where the idea was that they would land the gliders in a designated landing spot that had been arranged for them by the Norwegian resistance. So things didn't go very well to start off with. They'd not long taken off when the telephone cable between the bombers and the gliders broke down. When they got to the designated point, there was no way they could find. Everywhere was covered in snow. The tow lines broke with the ice. The Halifax bombers just had to leave the gliders to make as good a landing as possible. 1 Halifax bomber made it back to the UK. 1 Halifax bomber crashed into the Norwegian mountainside, killing 7 of the crew. The gliders landed in 2 different locations. The pilots in both gliders were killed, and 10 of the Royal Engineers were also killed. The Germans quickly located the first glider and immediately executed the survivors. The second glider were taken by another German patrol. There were only 9 people surviving. 4 of them were badly injured, and they were taken to hospital, where they were later brutally murdered. The 5 survivors were taken to Greeny Prison in Oslo, and they arrived there on the 21st of November, 1942. Greeny Prison had originally been built as a female prison, but it was taken over by the Germans when they occupied Norway, and it was used to house Germans who were most unsympathetic to the German occupation and to foreigners who were taken as a threat to the German occupiers. So that was 21st of November 1942. And then on the 14th of December, the 5 surviving Royal Engineers were joined by able seaman Robert Paul Evans. Evans had been found by a German patrol. He was injured again when they took him captive. He was taken to hospital locally, then taken to a hospital in Oslo, where his wounds were treated. And then on the 14th of December, he was taken and joined the 5 Royal Engineers at Greeny Prison. On the 19th of January 1943, these 6 Allied soldiers and sailors were told that they were going to be taken to a higher German authority for interrogation. And so first thing in the morning, they're taken from their cell. They were told that they'd be going through territory that they were forbidden to see. And so their eyes were bound, blindfold, etc., and their hands were tied behind the back. They're put in cars and they're taken for an hour-and-a-half journey that took them to Trondheim Forest. They were taken from their transport and marched into the forest, where they were lined up by 2 escorts for each of the prisoners. What the prisoners didn't know was that behind them was a freshly dug grave, and in front of them were 18 riflemen, a firing squad, 3 riflemen assigned to each of the prisoners, with orders for 2 to aim for the head and 1 to aim for the heart. The German officer in charge raised his hand. The firing squad took aim. The order Achtung was given. 18 shots rang out and 6 prisoners died. They were dragged into their grave. It was quickly covered over and they were left there. The soldiers. The firing squad was sworn to secrecy, and so that remained. So that from Operation Freshmen, out of 48, 41 were killed. And it was not until May 1945 that 11 mass graves were discovered in Trondheim Forest, and the exhumation began of 173 Norwegians, 15 Soviets, and the 6 British servicemen that had been killed. For the exhumation, the Norwegians had gone again to Greeny Prison, which was now holding Norwegians who had collaborated with the Germans. So these collaborators now had to have the unenviable task of exhuming the bodies that had been there for so long. The bodies were then examined by forensic experts and dental experts. Then the remains were cremated, and they were put into a grave in Oslo. So it was not until September 1945 that sadly Mr. Evans, Robert Paul Evans' father, received a letter to say that with reference to the letter forwarded to you in 1943, we have to report sadly that after all these long months of anxiety, your son, Robert Paul Evans, was executed by the Germans in 1943. My lords desire to convey to you their profound sorrow. So after all those years of waiting, that was the sad news that waited the father and mother of Robert Paul Evans, who lived in Brixton, London. As I said, the bodies were exhumed, cremated, and given a proper burial. They're in Oslo Western Cemetery, where they occupy a corner which is tended by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Thanks to the War Graves Photographic Project, a project that has seen the photographing of over 1.9 million graves, we do have a picture of the gravestone of Robert Paul Evans, able seaman, Royal Navy, HMS Titania, 19th of January 1943, which was the date of his execution. He was aged 21, in fact 21 and 5 days. His birthday, his 21st birthday, had been in Greeny Prison. And the epitaph at the bottom of his gravestone reads, "How strangely high endeavour may be blessed when piety and valour jointly go." A memorial has been erected by the people of Norway, the Trondheim Forest Memorial. It's now a Norwegian cultural heritage site, and it records the death of the people who were found in those graves in the forest. And so that is Operation Title, the sad end to the David and Goliath story, a sad end to able seaman Robert Paul Evans, but nevertheless, we will remember them. Thank you.
Thank you, Glyn. Jenny will shortly host the question and answer session, during which you can raise any questions by using either the raise hand symbol or simply raising your hand on screen. Matt, our IT guru, is now letting you all in. This process will take a little while due to the number involved. And I believe you may have to accept the request to become a panelist. But in the meantime, I've got a couple of questions for Glyn. Glyn, I'm more familiar with Operation Source, which was the midget submarine attack later on Tirpitz, which actually succeeded in disabling Tirpitz. And a number of medals were awarded during that or following that operation. Were any medals awarded to those who took part in Operation Title?
Indeed, there were, yes. Sub-Lieutenant Brewster, Jock Brewster, who led the Royal Navy party, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. And Captain Larson, who was in overall charge of the boat and the crew, etc., was awarded the Conspicuous Gallantry Medal, the CGM. What I did find out just last week was that one of my correspondents kindly sent me a note to say, and he sent me a certificate here that says, by the King's order, the name of Sergeant Donald Craig was one of the divers, by the order of the King, the name of Sergeant Donald Craig, Royal Engineers, was placed on record on the 28th of January 1943 as mentioned in a dispatch for distinguished service. I'm charged to express His Majesty's high appreciation. Well, I think if Sergeant Donald Craig was given a mention in dispatches, then it's most likely that Robert Paul Evans was given the mention in dispatch. And in fact, in the certificate that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission send to you when you make an inquiry, it does say, in memory of able seaman Robert P. Evans, mentioned in dispatches. Now, I've not been able to find through the normal channels of the Gazette and the supplement that sets out these commendations and mentioned in dispatches. I've not yet been able to find a mention of Evans, but I am working on it, and I'm hoping that I will eventually find it. I can't think that the mention in dispatches would have been for any previous operation, because basically Evans was involved for the years that he was employed in the Royal Navy. He was in strict training and was not taking part in any operations until he was told that he would be involved in Operation Title. So yes, 2 medals that I know of.
That's good. Have you been able to trace any relatives of able seaman Evans?
I've made a tentative start. It's very difficult. I've written to the Brixton local newspaper, which is called the Brixton Bugle, and they have a website which is called the Brixton Blog, and they've kindly put out a note setting out in brief detail Operation Title and the part that Robert Paul Evans played in it, but I've not had any feedback yet from the Bugle or the blog. But also I've been in touch with the Brixton Civic Society to ask them if they would have a look on the local war memorials, of which there are quite a few in their parish there, to see if they could find the name of Evans on any of the war memorials.
Thank you, Glyn. Moving to the rather sad end to your lecture, was any retribution extracted on the German officers responsible for the executions in Norway?
Well, the overall officers, as you will know from the Nuremberg trials in 1946, Jodl and Keitel were found guilty and hung of crimes against humanity and war crimes. And the case of Evans was brought up by the prosecution. So it was well known from secret German documents that had been found by the Allies after the war ended, that this atrocity had taken place and the circumstances surrounding it. And so Jodl and Keitel were hung. The local Germans in Norway, several Germans were tried there. One was hung, one was executed by firing squad, one was given life imprisonment, one committed suicide. Oscar Hans, who was responsible for the firing squad, he was captured in Norway. He was found guilty, but on appeal, he was allowed to go back to Germany. In Germany, he was rearrested by the Allies and put in prison, but he was out in 1954. Interestingly enough, the German naval officer who'd been in charge of the patrol boat that stopped Arthur, his superior officer, when he found out one of the boats had got through, a boat had got through his patrols, he committed suicide. So I suppose that was retribution.
Yes, of a fool, yes.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you very much for that, Glyn, and thank you very much for a very interesting lecture. I think, Jenny, we now have a possibility of opening the question and answer session.
Yes, indeed. 1 second. Okay, before we do that, I want to tell you all that Glyn has written 2 books, and one is The Maritime Art of Kenneth D. Shoesmith, little known today, 1890 to 1939, and his maritime art is perfectly captures the romance and adventure of the ocean liner in the 20th century. And also a book you might have seen before, Cargoes, which is a celebration of the sea, the poems of John Masefield. So if you'd like to purchase that, we can do that on the Wellington website, or you can contact Glyn and we'll let you have the address if you need that. And I wanted to tell you also about the next lecture, which is Monday the 13th of June, and it's Shipwrecks in the Thames, presented by Footprints of London tour guide Robert Smith. Really interesting lecture, I think. We're looking forward to that one. And as always, you know me, I would like to say thank you for your donations. And if you could consider donating again for the preservation and running of the ship, we would be absolutely grateful, and make sure the money is used in the best possible way. So now we're moving on to questions, and the first hand I saw come up was Bruce Lecrem.
Hi, and good morning from the middle of Canada. I'm curious to know if anybody could tell me, were any chariots, either Mark I or Mark II, ever preserved in museums or as memorials?
Right, unless anyone else wants to answer that, I think you will find that Gosport in Hampshire in the UK, there's the National Submarine Museum, and you'll find one there.
Oh, excellent, thank you.
Okay, it's quite some distance from Canada, but it's an interesting museum. It might make it worth your while.
I do have cousins over there, so I will visit again. I did visit the Portsmouth Submarine Museum. I didn't see one there, so that's the question. Thank you.
Okay. The other thing is that if you go up to the Shetland Islands while you're here, there is a museum at Scalloway on Shetland, where they do have a great museum that celebrates the Norwegians, the Shetland bus that was the ferry service across to Norway during the German occupation of Norway. That might be worth a trip to.
Thank you very much for that.
Thank you. And now Bruce Dennis.
Hi, Bruce.
Hello, perhaps it helps if I unmute. Enjoyed the talk, thank you very much indeed. I was curious what is known about Arthur, because you clearly have misleading information from one source that doesn't reconcile with another concerning her length.
That's
one
right.
of the more basic aspects of her life. What is known about her?
Well, I think there is more information that I can obtain once COVID lockdowns have let me get away. The last 2 years have been rather frustrating for my research. But as I just mentioned, there is a museum up in Scalloway, and I think they have got a model of Arthur that's probably been built to the proper dimensions to scale. I understand from the curator at the museum there that Arthur was actually located some while ago in a very poor condition, they did have some hopes of repairing her, resurrecting her, bringing her back, etc. But knowing what funding is like for projects of that type, it's very unlikely, I'm told, that that will happen, which is rather sad.
I noted the phrase was used that Arthur had been liberated by the participants in your operation that
Yes.
you're talking about from some previous owner.
Yes.
Yes.
What had happened was that Larsen and some of his Norwegian pirates, as I like to call them, smugglers, gun runners, etc., they'd gone on a mission over to Norway in one particular boat, which was sunk by the German Air Force. Larsen managed to get ashore in Norway, but not wanting to be left there, he managed to, I was going to say, persuaded someone to let him have their boat, but that's being too polite. He took the boat, Arthur, and made his way back to Shetland.
So it was a local boat from the area where it was then going to do its subterfuge.
Yes, it was. It was a local boat, and that was the whole idea.
Yeah.
That it would be sort of as inconspicuous as a boat could be. The registration number that was painted on the boat was a legitimate one, but from a different boat, so that it was almost legitimate. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruce.
I've got a question in from Mort Stoll. Have there ever been any computer assessments as to how Tirpitz should have fared had she encountered an American Iowa or North Carolina class battleship on the open sea?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know if any of the other people who are viewing might be able to answer that better than myself, because my research is basically on Arthur and on the Tirpitz itself, as opposed to how Tirpitz might have got on in an open battle. But I mean, she had a belt of armor 13 inches thick around her sides. She had deck armor of 8 inches thick. She was throwing these 15-inch shells amongst other armaments, etc. And she was never going to be let out on her own. She was always going to have a heavy escort. So I think Iowa, if she'd met Tirpitz, might have bitten off more than she could chew. But who knows? Who knows?
And another question, anonymous. How did the Tirpitz finally sink?
Well, Tirpitz was finally sunk by a squadron of 21 Lancaster bombers in 1944. They managed to get through the normal scramble of German local fighter planes. Didn't take place for reasons that seemed to be somewhat obscure, but they dropped the tall boy bombs that had been designed by Barnes Wallace. A couple of hits and a couple of near misses that were close enough to turn the Tirpitz over, put her absolutely out of action, and to kill around about 1,000 German soldiers. So yes, she was well and truly out of action in 1944.
And another one, was the Tirpitz better than Bismarck?
I'm sorry, I don't know.
Okay, are there any more questions from anyone? I can't see any more hands up. Please put your hand up if you'd like to. Bruce has come back straight away. Come on, Bruce.
Yes, I read a reference a long time ago to the potential for catching her if she ever went down the Kiel Canal. Do you know anything about that? Because it would have been the perfect place to cripple her and wreck the economy.
Indeed, but sadly, I have no information on that.
Thank
Ted,
you.
Over to you, Ted.
Lovely, thank you. Green Book, Ted van Bronswijk. the Federal Master for the Master Mariners in Australia. So very good friend of Alistair's, as
Hello,
you probably
Ted.
can imagine. And yeah, it's 3:30 in the morning here, so it's a little bit different. But I managed to get up and said, "Look, I enjoyed your talk very much.
Well,
Very interesting. There's a lot of things I didn't know. I used to work on the ferries out of Scotland up to Shetland and Orkney Islands,
right.
so well aware of the area that you're talking about, and you know, I've seen the monument up there in Shetland. But yeah, this was just fantastic. So thank you very much. And you'll be surprised that your voice is heard over here and halfway around the world in Australia.
Thank you, Ted. You can go back to bed now.
Thank you.
We're always impressed when guests come from a long way away and get up in the middle of the night. So thank you so much, Ted.
That's
nice
appreciated.
to see you again. Are there any more questions? Or shall we just have a general chat now? I can't see any more hands up and nothing more has come in. So Stephen Taylor, it's nice to see you, our dear chairman, on here tonight. How have you enjoyed it?
That was a superb lecture. It really was. Well done, Glyn. Some years ago, we were having a little holiday up in the northern Norway coast. And the mother of the Norwegian host officer on board the ship we were on had actually seen the Tirpitz finally sunk when the Air Force went into it. And she said it was quite amazing that the whole ground up there, as a bit of retribution, was flattened by the Nazis. So she remembered there's all coming across people in the water up in Trondheim Fjord. It was quite something to have a chat with her. That was a brilliant talk, Glyn. Many thanks.
Thank you, Steve.
Well researched.
Yep, the check's in the post.
I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is. Richard Shuttleworth, I see you on tonight. Thank you so much for coming on board the Wellington when we were open. That was much appreciated. And for everyone else, we are now open Sundays and Mondays if you'd like to pay a visit, and it's free to friends. So if you'd like to come on board and see everything that we have to show, which is the Lascar's South Asian Seafarers exhibition, which is attracting lots of attention. And also our augmented reality, the engine room, which is fascinating. And I'm going to ask Richard to comment on that in a second. And the AR in the wheelhouse, augmented reality in the wheelhouse, where you can actually steer the ship with the wheel. So,
and you can sink a submarine.
And you can sink a submarine, yes.
I did.
What do you think, Richard?
I thought it was brilliant. I was just going to say one quick thing to Glyn, because he mentioned Operation Source, and that was operated from HMS Varbel, somewhere on the west coast of Scotland, with the X-craft. And I think they managed to put 1,400 tons of water into the Tirpitz without sinking her before the RAF had a final girter. And my mother's stepfather, who ended the war as a captain on D-Day, became a King's Messenger. They designed the X-craft. I don't know how many of them were, about 7 of them. And they had a shore establishment, HMS Varbel. It's the only ship that's ever been named after 2 naval officers, because his surname was Bell. And I remember him quite well. He was a submariner in both World Wars and quite an eminent naval officer. But Jenny, your exhibition is excellent. When you go into the courtroom, you feel as if you're going into the boiler room and engine room. And for dummies, it'll tell you exactly how boilers produce steam to produce power for steam turbines and drive the screws. It's very nicely done. It's got a great atmosphere. And up on the bridge, you feel you're actually on the bridge at sea, and you have a chance to fire the squids, I think they were, and or the mortars, and sink a submarine if you can. It's very good. Well worth visiting.
Hedgehogs.
Hedgehogs, sorry, of course they are.
And Matt's going to grab the questions and answers that are coming in, but Graham Stoddart Stones has said, what if about Iowa versus Tirpitz, and has given us a website, a web address. So we'll forward that on to everyone. Now I can see, Bruce, are you back again?
Me, yeah. I was listening to the comment about the X-Craft raid on Tirpitz. It was my understanding that the raid was actually successful in putting the ship out of action, but the British, of course, were unaware of that. That the raid had displaced one of her engines on her mounts, on its mounts, and bent a propeller shaft. So the ship was effectively out of action at that point. At least that's my understanding. Although the British, of course, were not aware of that, so they continued, of course, to try to take it out permanently.
I can answer that one, Bruce. My understanding is that the damage that was done was quite considerable, although, as you say, the Navy weren't aware of that. And her steering gear was put out of action. As you say, a propeller shaft was damaged, and certainly 2 of the turrets were taken out of action as well.
Yeah, so the ship was really not a viable seafaring vessel after that, but who knew? So
I've got a question here from Di Somerville.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for a super lecture. Thoroughly enjoyed that. It's just a quickie on the X-Craft that were mentioned. I remember as a child being born and bred in Huddersfield, of all places, and being told after the war that the X-Craft had actually been made in Huddersfield and transported by rail from the station there to the necessary ports, one of which, of course, was Devonport, where I was told by one submariner captain I had, on Chalky, he was called, he actually had to transport this X-Craft from Plymouth to Portsmouth by train, and had the most enormous problems getting it out of the dockyard in Portsmouth because he didn't have a Form 4 or something. End of story.
Thank you so much. And it wouldn't be a lecture without talking to Holly. Hello, Holly.
Hello, David. Thank you very much for subbing in for Alistair. And Glyn, thank you for the very compelling presentation. It really got to my heart. My late father, I'm in Wisconsin, USA, but my late father was in the US Army, 1942 to 1945, England, France, and Belgium. So I guess war is not good, no matter which end of it is. And on a lighter note, Glyn, I'd like to say, I'm 10 years younger than you. So since you were raised in Birkenhead, you were raised right with Beatlemania and Jerry and the Pacemakers ferry across the Mersey.
Holly, I'm very impressed. Very impressed that...
Well, I remember those years, you know. I just, at the time, I didn't know what ferry across the Mersey was, but as an adult, I'm 67 years old. Now I know what it is.
Well, yes, I spent 12 years traveling backwards and forwards on the ferry, and the trip used to take about 15 minutes, so it was half an hour on the ferry boat every day, and I've added it up, and it works out that I've got 17 days sea time to my credit.
And I can imagine what it must have been like for my paternal and maternal great-grandparents and grandparents. They came from Russia, and they had to leave Liverpool in 1907 to get to America. So I can imagine what that journey must have been like.
Yeah,
so,
yeah. Slightly
thank
long.
you again for your talk. Please come back again.
Holly, thank you very much. Thank you.
Stay well. Stay well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Holly. I don't see any more hands up or any more questions. Thank you, Holly. And so I'm going to hand back to David to say the thank yous.
Right. Well, thank you, first of all, to Glyn for a fascinating lecture. And I hope to see you on board soon.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for attending. I I think at the last count we had 178 participants, which is a goodly number. So thanks very much, Glyn, for attracting that much attention.
I think it was the subject rather than the speaker.
Take the credit.
Yes, it was me.
It certainly was, Glyn. It certainly was.
Oh, that's very kind. Thank you.
Okay, well, it only remains for me to say thank you to everyone for participating, and we hope to see you at next month's lecture, which Jenny has given you information on.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
And good
Stay
night.
well, everybody. Happy
Thanks,
spring.
Jen. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.